Hello and welcome to Get Kafka-Nated. Today we're diving into one of the most heated debates in streaming infrastructure, the rise of Kafka and Kafka-compatible alternatives. I'm delighted to welcome Tristan Stevens, VP of Global Customer Success at Redpanda Data, who brings a unique perspective, having led both traditional Hadoop ecosystems at Cloudera and now next-generation streaming platforms at Redpanda. Welcome to the show, Tristan.
Hi, Hugh. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here, and I appreciate you making the time on a busy week with Big Data London to come on the show.
Just got back from the booth. Busy day there. Lots of interesting conversations this week.
Good stuff. So, jumping right into it, what does working in your role in customer success at Redpanda look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, great question. At Redpanda, we take a particularly engaged approach to customer success where we're really investing upfront in that customer relationship and making sure they get value from their investment. It's something we're doing a little bit differently to perhaps previous companies I've worked at, and really diving in deep with customers upfront. For me, I love learning about the business problems that customers are trying to solve, learning about their innovations, their business problems, their challenges, and thinking innovatively about how we can best help them ultimately. You get some fascinating stories from customers. Last week, I was talking with an EV manufacturer in the US who is basically streaming real-time telemetry from 1 million cars through to Redpanda and then doing like real-time live analytics on that. And if you think that sort of use case was pretty much unimaginable just 10 years ago, we've got a great team in customer success at Redpanda, and they're all focused on making customers as successful as we can. Customer obsession is one of our company core values and really runs deep throughout our team.
Super cool. It is crazy hearing about like customer use cases like that, where you're like, oh, like we work in a big data ecosystem, and they're like, yeah, live data from 1 million cars, and you're like, okay, that's a technical challenge.
It makes me want to be client side and go and do that sort of stuff again.
Yeah, I totally get that. And certainly there's some parts of that aspects of client side that I don't miss, but it's super interesting problems. Moving as you did from that kind of customer success role in the Hadoop world, and I know having been working on Apache Druid myself in the past, quite how different that is from the world of streaming. What surprised you most about that transition?
I worked in the Hadoop world for 7 years, and I think the journey during that time was really the commoditization of those types of technologies. So when I started at Cloudera, I joined pretty much at the peak of the big data boom, if you like, and pretty much at that time, everybody wanted a Hadoop. Every CIO, CTO you spoke to, they all wanted big data. They weren't necessarily sure what for, and actually the barrier to entry was really high. Like it was still really complex. Like writing MapReduce jobs and configuring Hadoop clusters was tricky. And I mean, to the point where at one point we were thinking about making professional services a mandatory purchase item because you just, like most customers just didn't have the technical capability to be successful on their own. And by the time I left, pretty much we were getting to the point where many of those smaller use cases had been eaten up by the CSP, by cloud service providers, and then the Snowflakes and Databricks of the world. And really Hadoop was left with two poles, one around those with like genuine planet scale data, and the other with those with really strict enterprise requirements that wanted an actual enterprise data platform, like your global 2000 companies. And really that was kind of what left. The kind of middle, the bulk that had been sort of adopting previously had sort of we're all moving away to a certain extent. What I think is surprising and maybe energizing about streaming is that the customers coming to streaming now are coming with fresh new use cases that you can't do on any other technology. You can't just load your data into a database and get results from 1 million cars like live and continuously. And so in streaming, I think a lot of times we're genuinely breaking new ground and doing stuff that you just can't do anywhere else. Hadoop was like that when I was doing that, and we were genuinely like doing stuff that had never been sold before. And it's great in the stream world that we've got that sort of energy and excitement that I think you don't get in many tech sectors.
That's awesome. Speaking of Hadoop, and to address the elephant in the room, although not the Hadoop elephant, Redpanda is obviously positioned as this kind of Kafka without the complexity, right? And we are on a show today called Get Kafka-Nated. From from that kind of customer success perspective, how much do you see those pain points around potentially the complexities of Kafka manifesting versus Redpanda?
Yeah, and I mean, full disclosure, I've been working with Kafka since around 2015, and I was working at Cloudera, working with Vodafone at the time, and we were doing. I mean, I went into Vodafone. I turned up for this engagement. They're like, right, we've got this telemetry use case, and we want to deploy some Kafka. And I was like, that is great. Give me a day. And I went and read everything I can. I don't think the Kafka definitive guide was out. And so we made a lot of stuff up as we went. And some of the blogs, I think, are still available to find. The reality of Kafka ultimately is that it was never really designed to be easy to use and maintain and monitor. Like in reality, today, it's still not that easy. And to a certain extent, no one's really incentivized to make it so. So because you've got commercial players that want to sell their own kind of managed product with managed things on top, that's kind of the nature of the open source ecosystem. And so all of that overhead of managing separate quorum nodes and doing capacity planning and JVM tuning and configuring replication and cruise control and all that stuff, it's all hard and manual work, and it takes time and money ultimately at the end of the day. And there are some great people in the community that know how to do this and are really, really good at their jobs. But for many companies, getting skilled SREs with then enough coverage to run that 24/7 by 365, you can easily be looking at sort of $500,000 for a medium complexity deployment when you kind of think about all those things that you need to think about across the lifecycle, like doing upgrades. Like that's something that continues, and you have breaking changes and all that stuff. And so what we were being driven towards ultimately was the likes of the major players in the space wanting us to go to the cloud, and ultimately they're there to monetize features. And so go and run let us run your Kafka workloads. It will be much easier for you. You don't need to have all these SREs doing all this complicated stuff. We can do all the auto balancing, and that's great. The reality is that's probably fine at the bottom end, but the more you get, the more expensive that becomes. And many people can't do that because of data sovereignty. We don't trust those providers. We don't want to put our data in their hands. And so when we designed Redpanda, it was all about, first, it was all about making it blazingly fast. I mean, that was the original, why are we doing this? It was because the thing's too slow. But also it's about making it really simple. The reality today is, and I think if Apache Kafka was designed in 2025, I don't think it would survive. Not because it's not good, because it's just too complicated. Developers move too quickly. They want stuff that just works. And if you look at something like DuckDB, it's just ridiculously simple, and you just kind of deploy it and get going. And I think Redpanda, it was very much we want to be focused on the developer and ultimately make the developer's life as easy as possible, meaning that developer doesn't need to spend time managing infrastructure, managing quorums and all that stuff that's hard. And ultimately that developer can just get on with the job of writing awesome code at the end of the day. And so it was really a play about one, performance, but two, simplicity. Just make it so simple, single binary, just deploy it like 3 lines of code, done. Which is why we see loads of Redpanda on people's laptops in like demos and places like that. CI/CD pipelines, just Redpanda all over the place because it's just that simple.
I really like that point around like ease of use, particularly. I mean, the DuckDB team are doing awesome things. Like I saw them demoing at the European Iceberg meetup a few weeks ago, just like, it's just curl and then like a 2 seconds and you've got the installable for DuckDB and you can just go, right? Like having that approach to building is so freeing. I know, having worked with Apache projects in the past, it's like, here's my collection of Java processes, which I now must tune and understand and stuff. But of course, being that product of what is it now, like 15 years of open source, and the necessary caution that has to come with being maintainers of large projects, meaning that you're like, okay, well, we're not necessarily like exactly where we want to be, but we have this kind of consistent offering, even if it is consistently a little bit fiddlier than other options. But yeah, that ease of use point I think is super interesting, of the trade-off between this big open source project versus these alternatives. What's driving, beyond necessarily just the potential simplicity gain of moving, or like maybe being a little bit faster, what's driving enterprises to make the switch from like established Kafka deployments to, say, Redpanda, given that that is not necessarily an insignificant choice, in terms of cost and complexity of like thinking about components like that in your data architecture?
Yeah, I think for me, there's four real reasons why we see users coming across to Redpanda. One, it's that complexity we just talked about, and as often as not, their journey starts on a laptop or on a CI/CD pipeline or a test environment, and kind of grows from there. They like use it and it works, and they're like, oh well, that was easy. It's almost too easy. Like how can we kind of keep going with that? There's the cost, and that cost comes in many forms, but that can be one, just the sheer performance of Redpanda means you need fewer brokers, and so therefore you have less infrastructure, you have less to manage, and so that's definitely cost in one dimension. With things like tiered storage, again, that can significantly reduce your infrastructure costs. Historically, with Kafka, you would have scaled your cluster based on the retention that you need, and then with tiered storage, particularly in Redpanda, and obviously it's coming to the open source Kafka in kind of dribs and drabs as we go. That can significantly reduce your infrastructure costs, because now you're constrained not on the disk, but you're constrained on the CPU. There's the cost relating to that operational overhead, and having the people and having the cruise control and having the doing all the upgrades and that kind of thing. And then the other one is our BYOC, our bring your own cloud offering, is significantly more cost effective than managed Kafka, than the managed Kafka offerings that you get from the vast majority of the market. As an example here, that EV manufacturer that I was talking about earlier, that was doing 1 million cars telemetry, they went from around 30 brokers on MSK to around 6 on Redpanda, and just the cost in all dimensions, just like the complexity and cost of hardware and the cost of people managing it, just significant. The third, so sovereignty is one reason why people come to Redpanda a lot. We hear this a lot, and so the BYOC, the bring your own cloud, is a game changer, and Redpanda completely shook up the Kafka industry with our BYOC model. What it means for our customers is they get the benefits of the managed service, but they're still retaining the custody of their data, which is super important if you're in a regulated industry. And I was just talking with a highly regulated financial services company just over lunch, which is why I was a little bit late. Apologies for that. Like they cannot let the data, like literally can't let it out of their firewall perimeter. Even in, like, they can work in a cloud, but they can't go into our cloud. And so BYOC for them is a real option. So yeah, regulated industries, but also just those businesses that need to keep their arms around the data. And I think that the data ownership and the cybersecurity world is getting pretty scary at the moment. And the fourth one actually is around support, and I'm particularly proud of our support team, who are currently running at around 98% CSAT. But we hear repeatedly that the support you get from the largest players in the market lets you down. No clear root cause analysis, no access to engineering, no follow through on cases. And we have a great team with some amazing tooling and a real focus on excellence that really sets us apart. And super proud of that team.
I think there's some great points there, and I really like exploring that idea of like the complexity of operating any kind of streaming operation, and the idea that like developers just want to build stuff. And I work in developer relations. I spend a lot of my time, trying to put my developer hat on from the last time I wrote a line of code professionally, but being like, I just want to build stuff. I just want to get this done. I want it to meet my SLAs, and then I want to go home and like spend time with my kids or play video games or whatever. Like, I don't want to be up at whatever time, and I'm trying to think what my last on call would have been now, up at 11 o'clock at night because my OpenSearch cluster on AWS is alerting because it's at 80% memory utilization. I mean, like, who cares, right? Like, so yeah, it is a really good point. And I think particularly to talking sovereignty, particularly in the current political climate around data and AI and the considerations we have to make, being in this position of being, European data companies is nice because it's like, okay, well, we can keep things within the European Union or we can keep them within the UK. And you've got that, the best practices for things like lineage and governance on top of your Kafka, such that you're like, okay, well, we are compliant and people can trust that their data is being handled appropriately and things like that. Like now it's, more important than it's ever been.
I think it's not just Europeans, actually. I think we're seeing, a lot more other countries, I think potentially sort of kind of South America as well, being much more sensitive around sovereignty and data sovereignty. I think that was something I heard just this week at Big Data London, just people starting to make more comments about that.
That's really cool. It's something I've not considered too much. I think a lot of my practice tends to get focused in on EMA, kind of hyper focused. I'm like, okay, I've got all my European meetups that I'm hanging out at. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense that internationally everyone is thinking a lot more about data sovereignty. I wonder how much like the kind of even further commoditization of data at the minute. Like we've gone from like this idea of like, oh, like we're in a big data economy to like data being the biggest part of many companies' businesses, or it wasn't before. If that's shifting a lot more focus onto like, oh, like this data is valuable, we need to protect it, that kind of thing.
100%. And I think where that can get really quite tricky is we're now starting to do things with agents, and we're empowering agents to talk to our data. Well, what permissions are we giving these agents? Like, are they going in as root? Like, I don't know, that's a good idea. And I don't even trust an agent to run on my laptop. Like, do I trust it with root access to my database? No. So, okay. What if it leaks? What do I give? Should I give access to my HR database? What if it leaks confidential information? Or what about it leaks customer data to another customer? Like, I think there's a whole load, there's the whole thing there about like data lineage and governance and kind of all that stuff in the agentic AI space, for sure.
Definitely. I think such a big topic in streaming at the moment. Segueing somewhat awkwardly onto another big topic in streaming at the moment. I think we were talking a little bit before about tiered storage, where we've had Satish on the show before from Uber talking about his work there on, getting KIP 405 out. A lot of talk at the moment about diskless. Obviously at Ivan, we're very excited to be helping to contribute to KIP 1150. In more recent weeks, there's been a lot of talk, and I think a lot of debate on LinkedIn and stuff like that about best approaches for getting data from Kafka into Iceberg, into these two big, and in Iceberg's case, increasingly big pillars of kind of the open source data landscape at the moment. What are your thoughts on, say, for example, the approach that we're very keen on here of Iceberg topics as a model for getting data from Kafka into Iceberg tables?
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating kind of watching, and I sort of left the kind of data warehouse, data lakehouse space when I joined Redpanda, and I think sort of just after I left, it all kind of got interesting. But what you've seen in that time is Iceberg. You had Iceberg, you had Delta Lake, and you had was it Hoodie? I think the other one. Those sort of competing, and so lots of FUD, and almost back to the good old days of Hadoop, where people throwing kind of mud at each other. And then all of a sudden you saw the Iceberg emerge as the clear winner in that data lake space, and it's great that we've now kind of got that consolidation, and everyone's now working. Like you've got Snowflake, you've got Databricks, you've got ClickHouse. Everyone can now query. Dremio as well can all query on the same format, which is fantastic for innovation. It means we're not competing over storage formats; we're actually competing over features, which is where you want to be. Competing. I think from the moment that you had the ability to store Redpanda data in tiered storage, the obvious next question was, well, can I query that? And we talked in the really early days of, well, could you have like what in the MapReduce days would have been like an input format and output format for our tiered storage model? Do you have like the Spark equivalent of that, and you just build a SERDI that we can then parse pretty much the Redpanda segments into a Spark job, and then sort of Iceberg just sort of emerge almost as an apparition of this is where we should land. And What that does is just hugely simplifies the landscape of your data infrastructure. Chatting with a customer a couple of months back, they've got something like 2,000 Spark jobs whose job it is to take data from Redpanda and store it into Iceberg. That's all they're doing. It's just taking it off the streams. They're doing other streaming analytics with it at the same time, but those jobs are basically taking it from the streams, storing it into Iceberg. And now what we can do is replace that with like almost pretty much a one-line config item of like Iceberg topic.enable. It's not that, but like whatever it's called. And you've reduced your complexity significantly. That's now 2,000 Spark jobs that you don't need to monitor and maintain and change when the schema changes. Like we're handling schema evolution and all that kind of thing. We don't need to worry about what happens if they get stuck, what happens if they have a bad letter. Like all that stuff kind of almost goes away. And what emerges is that coming together of the streaming and lakehouse worlds in what was perhaps improvement of that Lambda architecture. So whereas before we had very clear, this is the batch layer, this is the streaming layer, and then you had the kind of bit of how do we bring them together. Quite possibly now for maybe 90% of workloads, maybe 95% of workloads, we can just land it straight into Iceberg, into your lakehouse, and that's going to be quick enough for the vast majority of what you were doing. I know there's like several different implementations of Iceberg across the ecosystem, and they've all got their kind of relative merits. What I particularly like about ours is that it's two things. One, it runs in both schema-aware and schemaless mode, and we've got Proto, Avro, and JSON schema. That works really well, and you've got all the kind of schema evolution stuff built in. But for us, it runs in Broker. And so what that means is it works exactly in the same way in any cloud or in self-hosted or in on-premise. Like it's exactly the same code that's running. You're not run. There's not like a sidecar process that has to be managed and maintained and watched. So that's pretty cool. And I think it just really does unlock the power of your lakehouse and getting that, ultimately making the data available to you faster, which is ultimately what you need.
Super cool. I particularly like that. Having the option of being able to do schema aware or schemaless is huge, depending on like what you're building. Sometimes that can be so helpful.
Sometimes it's just land the data and like land data in whatever format, and then like we can sort it out later on. That's what the kind of schemaless mode is great for.
That's funny. We had Alex Merced on the show from the Gemio team a few weeks back, talking about almost like the kind of lakehouse wars, right, of all these competing standards. And then we crystallize around Iceberg. And I think we've, in the data space, particularly as it kind of intersects with sort of open source and stuff, we've seen this happen a few times where it's like, oh, like we have 4 different ways of doing this. Okay, we'll agree on one main thing. But then we have 4 different ways of writing to that one main thing and kind of on and on. So it is going to be super interesting, I think, to see where we end up with this, because, lots of very cool conversations happening right now about people being like, oh, okay, so I'm gonna write all my data from Kafka to Iceberg, but do I want to be able to query from my real-time data, low latency in Kafka in Iceberg format and stuff like that? Or do I want to be able to quickly, or, not necessarily quickly, but do I want to be able to have a path to move a topic from one type to another so I can migrate to something being in Iceberg and then migrate to it all being back in Kafka? Like, there are lots of different ways of cracking this nut right now, I think. There's a Flink joke in there somewhere, but I'm not going to make it. And it's going to be, I think, very interesting to see like what aspects of this are actually most useful for people when it comes to building stuff. Because I think that's ultimately how the decision gets made, right? It's that ease of use point you made before, but it's also like, okay, I can write Kafka data to Iceberg, but how is that fitting into my existing workflows or pipelines? How is that solving problems for me? So very, very excited to see where we go next. Looking back then, so that's just me getting all excited about Iceberg, as is kind of my my one at the minute. Looking back again then at your time at Cloudera, you headed up a pretty major migration there, as I understand it, sort of moving over to a new platform. How does that experience inform your approach now you're at Redpanda, when so much of what you guys are doing is thinking about migrations and moving platforms in that way?
Yeah, I think, and so I mean, just for context, for those that haven't been stalking me on LinkedIn, as I know you have, so I ran the team that was moving, helping customers to move from the legacy Cloudera and Hortonworks platform onto the new CDP platform. And I think the biggest challenge that we had was I mean, it wasn't straightforward. Like that was a one thing, but it was actually selling the value of the migration to the customers. For some, like they could see they were getting the best of both worlds, and they were like there on day one. They wanted the great new things in Ranger that they couldn't do before, or they wanted Kudu because they were just annoyed that they'd never had that before, because it was a bit tense, in the history of Cloudera and Hortonworks, and they did things differently, and there were some great things on both sides. And so some customers just wanted the new thing from the other side, and they were happy to move, and they were happy to take a little bit of pain. For the others, all they saw it was basically a break in compatibility that gave them nothing. They had a platform that was running, and it had its foibles, but it was fine. They value stability and reliability over all else. And then the fact that they had to move from Sentry to Ranger, or from Hive to Tez, or from Flume to NiFi, and then by the way, now you need to pay more for that. That just gave them a headache that frankly they didn't need. And so I think the contrast of Redpanda is that when the customers are coming across to us, generally it's all upside for them. They get the same APIs that they built upon, for better, for worse, but they get something that's faster, it's easier to use, it's easier to manage and deploy and all of their existing code is still going to work, whether it is Flume or NiFi, or whether it's in KSQL or Kafka Streams or some custom C code that they've written in Libody Kafka. It's still going to work in exactly the same way on Redpanda as it did before. And so they get all the benefits of a better, faster platform that's easy to use, but they don't get any of the pain of the transition. And I think learning from that painful migration story, I've just seen in the last few days that MSK are now forcing customers to do a full disruptive migration from Zookeeper to Craft. Is it K-Raft? Craft? I've never quite
now I'm second guessing myself. I think K-Raft people normally say, but I don't know.
Okay, and so comments. You've got to do that, but then what do you get? Like, do you get something that's easy to manage and use? No, you still get the same thing, right? And so for me, that's a bad experience. The lesson that I would take is, if you can avoid customers going through a painful migration, at least, if you're going to get that experience of having to do like an actual migration, like at least go to a better platform with better performance and better support and cooler features in Iceberg. That's the kind of what I take away from that.
I think that's a really good shout. Yeah, it's like seeing those kind of painful moments on the roadmap as opportunities to be like, oh, do we want to go do things differently? Do we want to use a different approach? As opposed to being like, well, another MSK migration, like just to have these features that are core for everyone else. Speaking about that kind of, the merits of some platforms versus others, cough, cough, MSK. The streaming infrastructure space is getting pretty crowded these days, right? On the open source side, you've got things like actually Kafka, and Pulsar. You've got, vendors like Redpanda, you guys are doing cool stuff with Kafka compatible things. Obviously, you've got MSK and Kinesis from the kind of hyperscalers. From your experience and with your customer conversations, how do you see the market evolving?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how the market has evolved just over the past few years, really. First up, Pulsar came along with their Kafka compatibility layer, which I think shook things up a little bit and really started to take the performance challenge to Kafka. Bear in mind, Kafka was never designed for performance. It was a log shipping tool designed at LinkedIn to work on end-of-life pizza boxes with spinning disks. And that's where Redpanda came along and said, well, what if we built something with like a performance engineering mindset that was optimized for modern hardware and designed from the ground up with developer and operator experience at heart? And so Redpanda has continued to innovate with things like tier storage and Iceberg topics that we've just talked about. And I think where the Kafka open source community has been, to a certain extent, competing with its own custodian, if we can say that. I think it's on certain features, it's struggled to consolidate around any single implementation. I don't think that's done the community any favors to a certain extent. And I think more lately now, there's been this handful of other implementations of the Kafka API, and that you're seeing now that the Kafka API is the lingua franca of the streaming space, in the same way that other open standards such as SQL or REST have really allowed for great innovation in other spaces. And I think that's really actually genuinely driving innovation, where previously that innovation was locked away by a vendor that, with the greatest sympathies in the world, was struggling with that classical problem of how do you make money from free open source software. Like I've been there. Like we've tried to do that with a reasonable success. I think what's great now for the consumer is that you've got both innovation and choice, and I think we'll continue to see this space grow, which is super exciting. Interestingly, like in the SQL space, where you had sort of some attempt at standardizations, you're seeing right now SQL starting to coalesce around PostgreSQL rather than ANSI, which is a pretty interesting development. And you've got the same shift in the lakehouse data market, which we just talked about with Iceberg. You mentioned Kinesis, which I guess is the anomaly in that list, in that it's a proprietary API. And I think even if you're all in on AWS, that vendor lock-in is real. And I had a customer recently who was on Kinesis. They got acquired by a company that has Microsoft as an investor. And now they're like, oh, no, we need to move off Kinesis. And so they need to go onto Azure. And they've got just a load of tech debt. And tech debt ultimately lowers your company valuation at the end of the day. And so that's where I think open standards rather than necessarily open source implementations, I think, are kind of where industry is kind of coalescing around SQL, the Kafka API, Iceberg, great examples of where that is.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it is interesting thinking about that relationship between the open source projects, which ultimately like end up shaping the API or whatever way you cut it. But the underlying implementation, where you go and get your speed or your efficiency or cost effectiveness, can happen out in the vendor space where this speed of iteration is faster. Gives you kind of that nice balance, right? Like, you can go to all these different, the Redpandas, the Ivans, I should be able to list more Kafka vendors off the top of my head, but it's been that kind of a week. For your implementation, and then it's the kind of the methodical approach of the Kafka community to kind of agree upon that API, which is the common language that we all speak for the streaming ecosystem.
Exactly.
Awesome. I don't think we have any audience questions, so I think I will wrap up there. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, Tristan, and for your insights. It's a really great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Likewise, always happy to come on and talk, and happy to be here.
Amazing. And hopefully I didn't fill too much of our time getting excited about Iceberg. Thank you to everyone who joined us live today for another episode of Get Kafka-Nated. Next time on the show, we'll be exploring the challenging world of streaming data simulation with founder at Shadow Traffic, Michael Jogalis, which is going to be super exciting. If you've got topics you'd like us to explore, want to be a guest on the show, or have feedback on today's episode, please reach out on LinkedIn. Always happy for a chat. We're always looking for new voices and perspectives from the Kafka community. Thank you all for listening.